It would be hard, Jesse, to find diseases, modern diseases, that are not either initiated or exacerbated by the microbiome. Look what we're doing with reuteri. Reduction of skin wrinkles, vaginal moisture, boost in testosterone, acceleration of healing, restoration of a youthful immune response, restoration of youthful muscle. Yeah, you're right. It's getting really powerful. I hear this too often. Oh, don't tell me about I take a probiotic. No, that's not good enough. That's the least important thing you can do currently.
Dr. Davis, you've been involved in this health world for many, many years now. And I'm guessing you've played with your diet and tried different things and experimented to get to where you are today. Let's talk about what you're eating these days and what you're recommending to others.
Well, as you know, lately in the last several years, it's become clear from other people's science as well as our own that the microbiome is a major player that was for many decades just neglected. Jesse, it wasn't that long ago people would be prescribed a course of antibiotics, suffer through a few weeks of diarrhea, and we just dismissed the whole disruption of the microbiome as this nuisance, as this curiosity, and had no impact. And because, of course, that's become clear that is not the truth. It is the disruption of the gastrointestinal microbiome, whether it's due to antibiotics or other factors, is a major detriment to health. And it has a major role to play in obesity, type 2 diabetes, cognitive decline and dementia, coronary disease, skin rashes, depression, anxiety, you name it. And the microbiome likely plays a role in at least exacerbating, if not outright causing that disease in the first place. And so the diet that I currently follow and advocate is one that achieves a number of things, but also helps to restore or rebuild as best we can in this world where we no matter what we do, we're still exposed to glyphosate. No matter what we do, we're exposed to go to a restaurant. You don't know it's in that food. So as best we can in a modern world, try to recreate kind of what your great grandma did. So the basic diet I follow is, of course, no wheat, grains, or sugars. Foods that never belonged in the human diet in the first place, especially wheat and grains. It was a mistake made 10,000 years ago. And we paid a huge price in chronic health problems because of it. Replacing nutrients that are largely lacking because of modern habits, like magnesium, because we have to filter drinking water. That removes magnesium. Vitamin D, that we try to get from sun exposure, from consumption of such things as eggs from birds and liver. But a lot of us don't get outside, or we wear clothes that covers the surface area. We don't eat enough liver. So address factors that influence insulin resistance and inflammation, and then address the microbiome. Specifically, that means such things as lots and lots and lots of fermented foods, that is, lacto-fermented foods, like kimchi and sauerkraut and fermented veggies. Very inexpensive, very easy, but a major advantage for health. So, and then, of course, nourishing microbes that are in your GI tract with various fibers and polysaccharides. So it's really, but if your great grandma was here, she would say, "Oh, Jesse, that's how we're supposed to eat." We just forgot because such things as dietary guidelines got in the way.
You said there the fact that wheat and grains are still off the menu for you. You've been talking about the dangers of wheat for a long time now. Has that position changed at all over the years? Since it has been, how long has it been since Wheat Belly came out? 10 plus years.
Yeah, maybe 12.
Has your stance evolved?
No, if anything, it's all the more. I'm all the more resolved. Unfortunately, the forces that try to sustain the status quo are very powerful. It is $1 trillion business. It's backed by federal governments in Canada and in the U.S. and elsewhere. Because that's how, this is how the world grew to 7 billion humans. If we were still hunter-gatherers or did something similar, that is, grabbed a spear, axe, or club, killed something while we gather roots and tubers and berries and nuts, and ate the diet programmed into the human genetic code, there would be no more than 1 billion people on this planet. So we've inflated it because of the proliferation of industrial grains and soy. And so, sad to say, Jesse, but this lifestyle of no wheat, no grains, that restores magnificent health, including magnificent metabolic health. Blood sugar drops, triglycerides drop, blood pressure drops. So many of the common chronic diseases that are treated with medication go away with wheat and grain elimination, amplified further by those nutrients that address insulin resistance, vitamin D, magnesium, omega-3 fatty acids, iodine, and then the microbiome issues. And so the people who follow my programs are slender, young, younger than their stated age. That's one of the great effects of this lifestyle. People say at 60 look like they're 45 or 40 or something like that, and they look and move that way too. But so, if anything, but it is an elitist stand. You can't do this in Somalia or the Sudan, right? Or rural China. So it is sad to say, not by design, but by accepting that humans made a huge mistake 10,000 years ago in misperceiving the seeds of grasses as food.
Well, there's some nuance there I want to pick apart. You've made it clear we're talking about wheat and all grains, the ideal. But for people who might be on all grains, including wheat right now, or just somebody that wants to find a more moderate stance to live in the modern world where, grains are everywhere, let's talk about the different continuum, because there's these different categories within that. We have the ancient grains, we have the gluten-free grains, we have sourdoughs that have been fermented. So what I'd like you to do as the expert in this area is take us through from bad to worse. Because again, there's no good here, but bad to worse, and your stance on all the above that I mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's clear the worst of all is modern, high-yield, semi-dwarf wheat. That is this thing concocted essentially in a laboratory in the 1960s and 1970s. It looks different. It stands about 18 inches tall. The stalk is very thick. The seeds are very large, and the seed head is very long. And yield per acre is greater. And that's why it was done. It wasn't created to screw with us. It was created to increase yield per acre for farmers. And it did. Typically 4 to 8-fold more per acre than traditional strains of wheat. But that is, when they changed it so dramatically in appearance and biochemically, they changed the effects on humans. One of the effects, for instance, is farmers wanted better resistance to pests, like molds and insects. And so they selected strains of wheat that were enriched in wheat germagglutinin, not gluten, but agglutenin, meaning agglutination of blood clotting. And so they had modern wheat is enriched in wheat germagglutinin, but wheat germagglutinin is a very potent bowel toxin. And it also has other toxic effects in the body. So they've increased it. They did it for pest resistance, not to screw with you, but inadvertently made it much more toxic, the modern wheat plant. Likewise, phytates. Phytates are also pest-resistant compounds in wheat and grains, and they chose strains with greater phytate content. But phytates, we know, bind minerals in your gut, like calcium and magnesium and iron and zinc, and you poop it out. And so that's why there's a lot of iron deficiency anemia, particularly in females. It's odd that it affects females more so than males. So it's very toxic and causes mineral deficiencies. They changed the structure of the gliadin protein. That's the thing that drives autoimmune diseases. It's the thing that gets partially digested to 4 or 5 amino acid long peptides that go to the brain and stimulate appetite. It's an appetite stimulant. So modern wheat is so different, and inadvertently they amplified the toxicity. So that's the worst. Little less worse would be traditional strains of wheat, whether it's the wheat from the 1950s or the wheat from the 19th century, or even if we go way back in the Middle Ages or biblical times where we had strains like emmer or einkorn, very different. So the traditional wild-growing wheat einkorn is a 14-chromosome plant. Modern wheat, high-yield semi-dwarf, has 42 chromosomes. To illustrate what that means, so Jesse, as a member of the Homo sapiens species, has 46 chromosomes. I have 46 chromosomes. Your listeners have 46 chromosomes. But modern wheat has 42 chromosomes. The traditional ancestral form of wheat, 14 chromosomes. Very different. So traditional strains of wheat, of which there are hundreds of different strains, a little less toxic. We go back, way back to emmer, and then einkorn, the original strain, a little less toxic. We go to other non-wheat strains like barley. Barley and rye are essentially identical in wheat genetically. They're closer than humans are to chimpanzees, so they're very, very close. So those are almost just as toxic as wheat. Then we get into the other grains. People don't think of grains this way, but they're promiscuous. They're genetically promiscuous, so they share a lot of genetic traits. So grains that aren't that all that popular, like millet or triticale, still share some of these effects, but we're getting less and less harmful. We get all the way down to the most benign, which is rice, because rice, a lot of the adverse effects of grains come by proteins because we're unable to fully digest a lot of the proteins of grains. Rice is about 1% or less protein. It's mostly sugar. But that highlights the problem with rice, that it's mostly sugar. And of course, more recently, it's been found that rice is a concentrator of arsenic. So such products as rice milks, often given to children, are very toxic. So I believe the USDA is contemplating banning them. And so, but there's no place in that spectrum where we could argue grains are good. There are various shades of less bad. It's kind of like low-tar cigarettes, filtered cigarettes. We get to a point where we've removed the tar and you use a filter, and now cigarette smoking is healthy for you. So not really. Small quantities of rice are probably safe. Small quantities of grains like millet, probably okay. It's when they become dominant. But if you get to the most toxic end, like high-yield semi-dwarf wheat, those are really toxic. Personally, if I get exposed to a breadcrumb, I'm not exaggerating, I get quite ill for about a day. I have a daughter-in-law who's got celiac disease. It takes just a spoon that contacted maybe a roux or gravy with a little bit of, and she'll be sick for about a week. She's got joint pain, abdominal pain, diarrhea, and other things. And so it's a reminder just how toxic it can be. So a lot of us who've been wheat and grain free for a number of years, you go to a restaurant, you ask them, I'm gluten free. We have to use that terminology, right? Because restaurant people don't understand wheat and grain free, and they get confused by the gluten free thing. As you point out, gluten free foods are horrible. They're horrible because they're typically made processed gluten free foods with cornstarch, tapioca starch, potato flour, and what I'm blanking this fourth: cornstarch, rice starch, tapioca starch, and potato flour. And those, so wheat products, because of the amylopectin A carbohydrate, raise blood sugar higher than nearly all other foods. The only foods that, among the very few foods that raise blood sugar even higher, cornstarch, rice starch, tapioca starch, potato flour. So people who say, I'm doing your program, I gained 30 pounds. And my abdomen's gotten really big, my blood pressure went up, my triglycerides went from 150 to 350. Are you eating gluten-free? Yes, I am, of course. Gluten-free processed foods are criminally bad for you, yet they're often touted as being healthier for you. They are not healthier. They have a different set of toxicities, but they are definitely not good for you. It's just a naturally gluten-free food. If it's an avocado, it's gluten. That's great. If it's a piece of pork, a pork chop, gluten-free, that's great. So naturally gluten-free is fine. It's what the food industry calls gluten-free. Baking mixes, bagels, cake mixes, all that stuff. That's the bad stuff. It's very destructive.
You mentioned the fact there your daughter-in-law reacts terribly as a celiac. You said yourself you react even to a little bit of wheat or gluten. You can specify. But are you celiac too?
I think I am. I've never had formal testing because I follow a lifestyle anyway. And you know what they say? If you want to be tested, you have to re-expose yourself for several weeks to generate positivity. Well, if I went back on wheat, I would be sick as a dog. I would have skin rashes. I'd become a type 2 diabetic, as I was many years ago, not anymore. Gastrointestinal distress, abdominal pain, anxiety, panic attacks, small LDL particles, coronary disease, high triglycerides, fatty liver. In other words, in order to prove it to myself, I'd have to destroy my health. And now, thankfully, a lot of that's reversible. Not all of it is, though. So, if you generate coronary disease because of a big spike in small LDL particles, that's what the amylopectin A of wheat and grain does. So, ironically, Jesse, we were told cut fat, eat more healthy whole grains. That is a formula to generate heart disease. And yet no one's apologizing for that. That science is quite well sorted out, by the way. It's not my speculation. That science has been sorted out and has been corrupted numerous times, starting with such people as Dr. Ron Krauss at University of California, Berkeley, and other groups. They have shown that it's the consumption of wheat grains and sugars that is a huge provocative agent for the formation of small LDL particles, the real cause of heart disease. That LDL cholesterol is a crude indirect marker for. We can measure small LDL particles and other factors that cause heart disease, but pharma doesn't make money from it because there's no profit-making drug for it. When you start to do the real test for heart disease, by the way, which is just lipoproteins, and I use the NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance lipoprotein testing, it becomes immediately obvious that heart disease is a disease of diet. It has nothing to do with the need for drugs. Nothing to do with it. So that's why they maintain this fiction that you must treat cholesterol. This crude, outdated marker that should have been abandoned decades ago, because it's such a lousy marker, it gives the appearance that you need a drug to reduce it.
Well, the sad thing is, people that are actually taking the time to follow the dietary guidelines are going to be misled down this path, which in and of itself takes energy, and it makes sense people would trust the higher ups. So it's really a messed up system, and I don't know what's going to change it.
Things like what you're doing right now, talking to people who don't just take the status quo or the prevailing wisdom as fact. You know, in the U.S. alone, 80 million people take a statin cholesterol drug, and there's been no reduction in cardiovascular events. And your hospital throws a party because they just added a $100 million wing for cardiovascular disease. So cardiovascular disease is the number one moneymaker for the healthcare system. There's very little incentive to reduce heart disease risk. And yet reducing risk for heart disease is easy. It's simple, it's straightforward, and has nothing to do with prescription drugs. It has to do with some basic issues like not consuming something with the amylopectin A as in wheat and grain that spikes up small LDL particles, not having insulin resistance, very easy, by the way, not having inflammation, silent inflammation, very easy, by the way, and most recently added to the list in the last few years is address the microbiome, the gastrointestinal microbiome, and thereby the phenomenon called endotoxemia. And all that means is a disrupted gastrointestinal microbiome results in release of something called endotoxin from fecal microbes that is able to cross into the bloodstream. Endotoxemia. That's a major driver of all kinds of disease, including coronary disease and stroke, breast cancer, skin rashes, rosacea, psoriasis, brain effects like cognitive impairment, Parkinson's disease, anxiety, depression. In fact, it would be hard, Jesse, to find diseases, modern diseases, that are not either initiated or exacerbated by the microbiome.
Well, let's take that story and go even further. You talked about the endotoxin. What I'm assuming you're referring to there is the LPS. So let's get into the details, the physiology, how that's produced. The way I see it, that's actually a normal part of our digestion when it's in check. But I'll have you talk about that and then when things go awry.
I think the biggest problem comes, so there's grades of disruption of the gastrointestinal microbiome. So some people just have disruption of the species in the colon, where microbes are supposed to be. Loss of beneficial species. Beneficial species do good things, or did good things for us, including suppress the fecal microbes. These are microbes like E. coli and Salmonella and Campylobacter, which many people recognize because those are also the microbes of food poisoning. So let's say you went to a fast food restaurant and the kid serving your food just moved his bowels and didn't bother to wash his hands. So he just gave you a serving of E. coli. Or they serve you some chicken that was undercooked but sat on a cutting board too long and has Salmonella. So you take those, and those species, E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter, and others, live in your colon. We have them, and they live there quietly. But when you ingest them in some contaminated food is when you get nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and diarrhea, and you get quite sick. Now, wait a minute. If those microbes can live quietly in your colon, why do they make you so sick when they hit? Well, it's a reflection, Jesse, that fecal microbes are not tolerated in the upper GI tract. And so one of the things that's happened in a lot of people, as you likely know, we lose the suppressive beneficial microbes in the colon. Fecal microbes start to proliferate, but even more remarkably, they ascend into the 24 feet of small intestine. Now, the small intestine is not well adapted to having trillions of fecal microbes. The colon is, but not the small intestine. Small intestine is by design a place where you absorb things. It's permeable so that you absorb amino acids and fatty acids and vitamins and minerals. But when fecal microbes colonize the small intestine, trillions of them, they only live for a few hours. They don't live for years or decades. So there's huge turnover, trillions of microbes. And when they die, as you know, one of the components, there's a number of components that they shed. One of them, most important, is the LPS endotoxin, as you know. There's other things too, lipoteichoic acid and some others. But LPS endotoxin being the dominant one from fecal microbes. So you have this flood of this endotoxin into the small intestine permeable, endotoxin able to enter the bloodstream. First enters the portal circulation, the portal venous circulation that drains to the liver. So your poor liver takes a beating. It's one of the big contributors to fatty liver and non-alcoholic steatohepatitis and cirrhosis. But a lot of those endotoxin also get into the systemic bloodstream and play a role in all those conditions: diabetes, heart disease, dementia, skin rashes. But it's now clear, over the last 15 years, this science is maturing to tell us that microbes in the GI tract, but especially when they ascend into the small intestine, that's how they export their effects to other parts of the body. Jesse, I thought this was uncommon. I thought this idea that fecal microbes could colonize the upper GI tract was SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. I was guilty of thinking it was uncommon or rare until this came out. The AIR device. This is the old one. This is the newer one. This one measures hydrogen gas on the breath. You blow into it. It talks to your smartphone, 0 to 10. Or this one here is the newer one, which measures hydrogen gas and methane. And people don't have to buy these things. But when it came out about 2018, I got a hold of it. And it became clear the inventor is a PhD engineer, and he didn't fully understand what it was he invented. So I called him. I said, Angus, this is not what you think it is. I'm telling the inventor, a good guy. It's a mapping device. It can help you determine where microbes are living. So it's not a detection device so much. It's a mapping device you can use. So your colon is supposed to produce hydrogen gas. What you want to know is if there are microbes in the upper GI tract, stomach, duodenum, jejunum, that can produce hydrogen gas. So you do a baseline. There's a whole prep and all that, but just for the sake of brevity. So you test the baseline, let's say 1.2, 0 to 10, and then you ingest something that microbes metabolize. We use inulin because most unhealthy microbes love inulin. So maybe a couple teaspoons of inulin in your coffee, and then 30, 45 minutes later, test again. 9.8. Well, if you can't, that inulin couldn't get to your colon fast enough to be metabolized to hydrogen gas. So that has to be in the upper intestines. Up to about 90 minutes. Beyond 90 minutes, we don't know if it's distal ileum or colon. So it's very useful. But the reason I tell you this is because once I got my hands on this device, a lot of my followers did, it became clear, Jesse, that small intestinal bacterial overgrowth using his mapping device was everywhere. It was the unusual person who tested negative. Now you might say, well, maybe the device is flawed. Maybe the concept is flawed. Except that we addressed it, the proliferation of microbes in the upper GI tract, and people would say things like this. Oh, now I'm testing not 9.8, but 1.3 or something like that. And my weight loss plateau broke. Or my rheumatoid arthritis finally went away completely. It got better with wheat grain elimination, some of those other things. But now it went away. I stopped the last drug. My depression finally lifted. My panic attacks finally stopped. In other words, we saw some residual health problems disappear. So I become convinced. And these data exist. Not my data, other people's data. Studies like this. If we take people with irritable bowel syndrome, what proportion will test positive for SIBO? So there's 60 to 70 million people in the U.S. alone with irritable bowel syndrome. And Results vary with the study, but roughly about 40% of those people test positive for SIBO. So 40% of 60 to 70 million, well, it's 24 to 30 million people right there. How about obese? There's something like, I forget the exact now, 130 million Americans who are obese. 50% will test positive. Add another 60, 70 million to that list. Fatty liver. 35% of the U.S. population has fatty liver. Canada also. Well, that's 35% of 300 plus million. Let's say 100 million. 50% will test positive for SIBO. Add another 50 million. Now, there's some overlap. Obese type 2 diabetics with fatty liver. But you add all the numbers up across neurodegenerative disorders, autoimmune diseases, type 2 diabetes, etc. And you rapidly see, wow, conservatively estimated, there's 100 million Americans alone. That means probably something like 10 million plus Canadians. Like 1 in 3, perhaps even 1 in 2. It's not uncommon. And if your doctor, let's say all the doctor does for your diabetes is give you drugs for blood to reduce blood sugar, but didn't address the underlying SIBO and endotoxemia, he has resigned you to a future of weight gain, diverticular disease, emotional problems like depression and anxiety, increased potential for cognitive impairment and dementia. In other words, if you don't get at the root cause, or at least a major player in the disease, all you do is pay attention to blood sugar, you're doing that person a major disservice. So you got to address the contribution of the microbiome. And by the way, we have a very clean way to address that issue. Very different from the conventional. Should I tell you about it?
Well, we'll get to it in a sec. I want to make sure we're all on the same page here. Let me go over what you just went over in detail and try and summarize it. So bacteria from the large bowel are going up into the small, and these are known as the quote-unquote bad bacteria, which are okay when they're in the large bowel, but when they come up, that's when they become a problem. They die there. Part of their death is going to be this LPS from their cell wall. Because the small bowel is an absorber, we're going to pull that into our bloodstream, and then it becomes systemic and causes all these kind of problems. Do I have that right?
Exactly right. So, if you got real sick, heaven forbid, let's say you had a bladder infection. Mostly women get these things, right? So a woman has a bladder infection, cystitis, but then it ascends up the ureters into the kidneys and becomes pyelonephritis. Now you can get very sick. And then if the bacteria, let's say E. coli or Klebsiella, then gets to the bloodstream, that's sepsis, and you get very sick. You might be put on a ventilator for acute respiratory distress syndrome. You might go into kidney failure. You could be delirious, have put on medications to keep your blood pressure up because you're going into shock. I mean, really, really sick. Well, if you measured LPS endotoxin in sepsis, it goes up about 100-fold over the normal situation. So in endotoxemia, like you and I are talking about, where we just have proliferation of microbes in the small intestine, it goes up about 2 to 4-fold, 200 to 400%. So it's not as bad as 100-fold of sepsis, but it's still bad enough to have all these adverse effects. So it's kind of like an instance of mini sepsis.
To make sure I have some of the details here right, the bacteria that are dying in the large bowel, these ones that went up to the small in this other story we were telling, and they're producing LPS, is any of that absorbed into the bloodstream? Remember before I said something about a normal amount of LPS? That's what I'm getting at. The LPS that's produced in the large bowel, does that stay there because the large bowel is, thicker and designed to be mostly pulling things in?
So, you're right. Some gets into the bloodstream, especially from the ascending colon. So some do get, so there's a normal, very low-grade level of endotoxemia that just occurs even in normal, healthy people. But it's the rise, it's the rise in endotoxin level in the bloodstream through the permeable small intestine. That is, I believe, the biggest problem. So our jobs is to recognize it. You could use the air device. There's also there's some very reliable, what I call telltale signs that this is happening to you. So symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome would be a very good sign. Irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, is in most cases SIBO. It's just mislabeled. People with fibromyalgia, a very high likelihood, maybe as much as 100%, have SIBO and have it very bad. People who have fat malabsorption, that is, you go number 2 and you look in the toilet and there's fat droplets floating, or there's staining of the porcelain. That's from microbes in the duodenum, way up high, just after the stomach, that block the action of pancreatic enzymes and bile and prevent you from digesting fats. Food intolerances. People say, oh, I can't eat nightshades. I can't eat FODMAPs. I can't eat histamine-containing foods. Or I got IgG food intolerance testing, and I can only eat these 9 foods. Or I can't eat these 42 other foods. Very unnatural. Those are almost all examples of SIBO. And so eliminating those foods is not the solution. In fact, eliminating those foods, like a low FODMAP diet, may actually make the situation worse. It provides near-term relief from gas, bloating, and diarrhea, but it doesn't correct the situation. It doesn't correct the fact you have 30 feet of fecal microbes living and dying and increasing the permeability of your intestines and generating food intolerances. And the vast majority of food intolerances go away. Just like our great-grandmother's day, right? Where your great-grandmother say, Jesse, we didn't have any of these things. We would eat food. In fact, food were sometimes scarce, and we were grateful to have food. No one had a list of 37 foods they couldn't eat.
Well, before we get into how to solve this in a natural way, which we're going to get into the details here, let's talk about what's happening to that person, which is super common, as you've stated. What is changing to allow that bacteria to come up? What are the normal mechanisms, is what I'm getting at, to keep that in the large bowel that are going awry?
So it's the loss of microbes, healthy microbes that suppress proliferation of fecal microbes. Loss of species like various lactobacillus species, bifidobacteria species, Faecalibacterium, Akkermansia, on and on. Lactobacillus, Ruminicacea, long list. Literally hundreds of species. But I believe, it's my view, it's mostly the loss of 2, Lactobacillus reuteri and Lactobacillus gasseri. And the reason I believe that, Jesse, is because those 2 species are especially good at, 1, surviving stomach acid and bile. So you take, say, 100 billion, most of it survives. That's not always true for all microbes, but those 2 are very good at surviving stomach acid and bile acid. They're also unique in that they colonize the small intestine. That's where the battle's being fought, in the small intestine. And these guys colonize the small intestine, where they take up residence and produce what are called bacteriocins, natural antibiotics effective against fecal microbes. So we actually put this to use. We ferment those 2 as a yogurt or other food. And I regret calling it yogurt. People think, oh, I can go to the store and buy it. No, that's something entirely different. This is something that looks and smells like yogurt, but it's not the stuff you buy in the store. We're going to just use this yogurt-like material to amplify bacterial counts to hundreds of billions per half cup serving. So we ferment Lactobacillus reuteri and Lactobacillus gasseri. Optionally add Bacillus coagulans. Bacillus coagulans is a spore-forming microbe, and oddly makes the most delicious yogurt you ever had. So if you add it, the gasseri is not that tasty. It's kind of bitter, and the reuteri is a little bit sour. So if you add the Bacillus coagulans, you add some more bacteriocin producing capacity, and it makes it taste much better. But it's optional. But we make this yogurt, use extended fermentation, because microbes don't have sex, right? There's no male and female microbes. They have asexual reproduction. So reuteri, for instance, doubles itself every 3 hours. So if we did a factory where they ferment for 6 hours, you got nothing. We're going to ferment for 36 hours. We allow the microbe to double 12 times. We perform something called flow cytometry on the yogurts, and we get about 300 billion per half cup serving. And you consume that. And so far, Jesse, being guided by these devices, of about 50 people who've done this, 90% have converted to negative for hydrogen gas. It takes about 4 weeks, sometimes longer. So it's longer than the course of antibiotics. And that, by the way, is the conventional solution. If your doctor even knows what SIBO is, they'll give you a prescription for Xifaxan or rifaximin. It's very expensive, It has risks like Clostridium difficile and enterocolitis, which is very bad. And you know what? If antibiotics got us here, Jesse, do you really want to take another antibiotic? So what we're doing with the Gasseri and the Rotari is also extremely safe, because what we're really doing is replacing very important microbes that you should have had all along from your mom, from birth, breastfeeding, contact. But these microbes, despite being such powerhouses of natural antibiotic production, they're also very susceptible, very vulnerable to conventional antibiotics like amoxicillin. So if you took amoxicillin 20 years ago for, say, an upper respiratory infection, you wiped out your Rotari and your Gasseri, and you opened the door to fecal microbes to ascend.
All right, so we make this quote-unquote yogurt using these 3 species. Are the strains, I'm assuming they are, specific as well that we need?
Yeah, I want to expand the menu of microbes that do this. So we're doing some animal work and some human work. But right now, the strains we know work. And by the way, we should mention to your listeners, the reason we have to pay attention to strain is because strain as well as species can make a difference. So to illustrate, so I've got E. coli, Jesse has E. coli, listeners have E. coli. But what if you ate lettuce contaminated by cow manure and a different E. coli strain? You can die of that E. coli. Same species, E. coli, different strain. So sometimes it's the life-death difference, literally. Sometimes it's not. So it depends. So with regards to what we're doing with this, what I call SIBO yogurt, we know that I'm sorry about these names, the ATCC PTA 6475 strain works. Available as a product called BioGaia, either Osfortis or Gastris. The BNR 17 strain of Lactobacillus gasseri, and the GBI 36086 strain of Bacillus coagulans, also known as the Ganeden strain. So people have to write this down. You know, it's in my Super Gut book. It's in my drdavisinfinitehealth.com blog, where you can get them also. So these we only talk about microbes that are commercially available. I have access to microbes that are for research, but I can't share them with people. There's regulations over these kinds of things. In other words, I can't get a microbe from a repository that's been used for research and give it to you. I can't do that because there's some safety issues involved. So we can get commercially available microbes. But thankfully, more and more microbes are becoming commercially available. And so those 3, and the great thing is, once you buy the 3 sources, but you never have to buy it again. Because whenever we ferment things, whether it's yogurt or coconut milk or hummus or salsa, you can ferment all kinds of different things. You get your microbe, you ferment the first time, and then you make your next batch from a little of the prior batch. So you don't have to buy it again. So it's and you can do this, by the way, also with your probiotics. If you're sick and tired of paying $50 for your probiotics, ferment it. And you get those microbes in your yogurt or other fermented foods. And you don't have to buy the probiotic as much. Maybe every so often you have to. And there's all kinds of fermentation projects, Jesse, that are very inexpensive and extreme. Fermented foods, whether made from a probiotic or as SIBO yogurt, or whether you got it from some kombucha or starting culture, or you just ferment it from the microbes resident on the surface of a vegetable. These are among the most important things you can do for restoration. People think probiotics are the most important. No, probiotics are the least important thing you can do, at least for the current crop of what's being sold as probiotics. Because modern probiotics are mostly just haphazard, slapdash collections of microbes. There's a lot of room for improvement in the probiotic world. But for that reason, the least important thing you do is a probiotic. I point that out because people say, we'll talk about the microbiome. And they say, oh, no. Don't worry about me. I take a probiotic. Well, good luck with that, because it's the least important thing you need to do.
And would you say in a similar way, when we buy fermented foods, kombucha, products that haven't been pasteurized, that we're getting this good bacteria, it's kind of the Wild West there as well, right? I mean, we're talking here about all the nuances, the species and strain and different amounts depending on how long you're fermenting. My guess is it's kind of the Wild West, and it'd be very difficult to be specific if you're just going to the fridge and buying different organic fermented foods and trying to count on these companies to do it the right way for you and you getting what you want in the end.
Yeah, variety is key. But the odd thing about fermented foods, if we believe the Sonnenberg data from Stanford, Erica and Justin Sonnenberg, who published a very important study 2 years ago, and all they did was take young people and ask them either take in lots of prebiotic fibers, that is fibers that nourish microbes, like the inulin FOS in onions and garlic and shallots, or the galacto-oligosaccharides in legumes. So eat lots of those. Another group, eat lots of fermented foods, like 6 to 8 servings of fermented foods, like kimchi, kombucha, kefirs, yogurts, etc., per day. And by far the most superior increase in diversity, the number of species, were in the people who consumed lots of fermented foods. Now, the peculiar thing about that, Jesse, is the microbes in fermented foods, let's say some kombucha, or some kefir, or some kimchi. Well, those are species like Leuconostoc mesenteroides, or Lactobacillus plantarum, or Pediococcus pentasaceus, or Pediococcus acetylactosi. So they're very specific, mostly room temperature fermenting microbes. But the peculiar thing is the microbes that reappear in your gastrointestinal microbiome are not those guys. They're Clostridium species, they're Fecalibacterium species, they're Lactobacillus species. So there's something that happens when fermenting microbes pass through your GI tract. They somehow set the stage for the restoration of lost microbes. It's probable that they're there, but they were latent in very small numbers and essentially undetectable, and that somehow the passage of fermented foods allows them to get reinvigorated, because there's a dramatic restoration of multiple species. Now, there's more that people can do, but just the consumption of lots and lots of these fermented foods with these microbes, these room temperature fermenting microbes, is somehow sufficient to restore tremendous species diversity of beneficial microbes.
That is so fascinating. And now that we know we're activating or bringing back these microbes that aren't even in the ferments, are the ones that are actually in the fermented products populating as well? So is it an activation of dormant ones plus populating whatever was in that food or drink?
Mostly don't. So like the Pediococcus acetylactosi, very, very important microbe, just passes through, does not take up residence. The Leuconostoc mesenteroides just passes through. There are exceptions. Lactobacillus plantarum does take up residence, and there's some others that do take up residence. But for the most part, it's probably not from those guys. There's something unique about the passage of fermented microbes through the GI tract. But so far, no one's quite put their finger on what that process looks like. But it's probably, because, you can't, remember they had the old myth that a pile of oily rags is the source of rats?
I haven't heard that one.
No. So in the hundreds of years ago, they always say you had a pile of dirty rags in the corner. It would make rats where rats came from. Well, of course, that's nonsense, right? You can't create rats' rags. Well, same thing here. We can't create microbes. They're living creatures. They had to come from somewhere. They must have been latent, or maybe fermenting microbes somehow make you more receptive to acquiring microbes from other people, from your kids, from your spouse, from friends, from the dog, from doorknobs, tablecloth, who knows? So it's an uncertainty, but if we believe the existing evidence, it's fermented foods that are the most important thing you can do. And you know what? And you can tell people who add fermented foods, they'll start to say within a few days to weeks, I'm feeling different. I'm happier. I'm more energetic. I'm more regular. My skin is better. So, there's very perceptible changes with the reintroduction of fermented foods. And, if you talk to if your great grandmother was still alive, she would say, "Oh yeah, sure, Jesse, of course we did. That's how we stored food, and it made food taste better too. My dad would make sauerkraut in the basement. All those stories."
And given that research, the piece of curiosity it opens up for me is the importance of having different fermented foods. So kimchi, kombucha, regular sauerkraut. This is getting very technical and nuanced for people. So what I'm trying to do is simplify it best we can. And what I'm getting at with that is, would the benefits be similar just to have a fermented sauerkraut in the fridge and have a good amount of that per day? Or are there different advantages, given what you just said about the fact that it's not what's in the fermented product, but it's activating something in the system? So a lot there, but what I'm getting at is there are advantages of having kimchi, sauerkraut, kombucha to have a diversity of different bacteria coming in. Will that activate different bacteria within? Or can we just stick to one fermented food?
Variety is probably key because there's different strains. So let's say you like Lactobacillus plantarum from fermented meats, but there's a different strain in the kimchi. There's a different strain in the sauerkraut, and so different strains, different effects. So there's that. Also, it helps to have a variety of prebiotic fibers and related compounds from such things as root vegetables, leeks, dandelion greens, onions, garlic, shallots, because they nourish microbes. That alone also changes the composition of the microbiome. So variety is key. I've seen this happen. Somebody says, with a prebiotic fiber, for instance, inulin FOS you can buy commercially. You can get it from food, but you can buy it commercially, and they only use that. And they actually generate adverse effects. So variety is the key. Just as people did all throughout human history. We didn't eat one food. We ate a variety of foods. And so I tell people, don't make this harder than it is. It's really very easy once you get the hang of it. But there's two general classifications of fermentation. There's things that ferment at room temperature. That would be like kombucha. You can make it right on your kitchen counter, or you're going to ferment maybe some cucumbers right on your kitchen counter. Then there's microbes that ferment at human body temperature, so more towards like 37 degrees Celsius or 98 degrees Fahrenheit. Those are the species like Reuteri, Gasseri, other Lactobacillus species, Bifidobacteria species. Those prefer human body temperature, meaning they proliferate more rapidly at those temperatures. And so if you're going to just ferment on your kitchen counter, you don't need any fancy equipment. You do need to use filtered water that has no chlorine because it's antimicrobial. You need to use salt to make a brine, like 2 tablespoons per quart or per liter. Non-iodized, right? Because iodine is antimicrobial. And then you chop up your veggies, put it in, and you can rely on the microbes on the vegetable surface, or you can use various things as starter cultures. You can buy commercial starter cultures. If you have something already fermented, let's say some commercial kombucha, add a tablespoon of commercial kombucha. You could add a little bit of a probiotic. Let me take that back because the probiotics are sometimes the other kind. But you can use all kinds of little starter ways. If you use a starter culture, it ferments faster, as opposed to fermenting from microbes living on the surface of that cucumber or radish. But then there's the human body temperature microbes, and that you need a device. You could make a yogurt maker, could be an instant pot, could be a sous vide, or some device just to keep the temperature at about 100 degrees Fahrenheit so the microbe grows. That's where people get a little confused. But it's just a matter of temperature.
Okay. So coming back to my point there is advantage having diversity because of different fibers and also the fact that different bacteria that are on these different ferments are going to activate different things in the system. And we're going to get to fermenting Reuteri and making our yogurt here in a bit. We did cover that last time, but I want to make sure we cover it again. It's really important and to see if there's any new nuances there. You talked about starter. It got me thinking about starter for the Reuteri. Last time we talked, it sounded like you had to order different bacteria, and you alluded to that again earlier here. It sounds like it's still a little bit complex getting the different bacteria to start the first time. Is there anybody, because of this book and your talks, or yourself, putting together a commercial starter that includes Reuteri and the other bacteria you talked about for the yogurt?
You know, there is a company owned by friends of mine, called Cutting Edge Cultures. It's a Canadian-U.S. company, and they have not the combination, but they have a Reuteri and they have a Gasseri. That would work. The Bacillus coagulans, if you choose to use it, but I tell you, if you just want a really tasty yogurt that tastes almost like thick whipped cream, it's Bacillus coagulans, which surprised me. Bacillus coagulans is a spore-forming soil-based microbe, and it makes this delicious yogurt. Who would have guessed? That you can get at the store. I believe both in U.S. and Canada. In the U.S., it's called Florastor. I'm sorry, Shift Digestive Advantage. So $15, something like that, and all you need is one capsule. And so you buy it once. There are sources that, yeah, this is kind of hard to do in a podcast, but know that there are sources you can get these things from. The best thing is what I used to do in my neighborhood is I just have a party and I give you a little bit of it, a couple of tablespoons of the yogurt, curds or whey, solid or liquid, doesn't matter. They both have microbes. I give it to you, like a little container cover, and here's how you get started. So if you have anybody who's doing this, you can get started with those microbes. That's the best way when you have everybody doing it around you, or your family or something like that. If you don't have access to that, then in my Super Gut book, in my drdavisinfinitehealth.com blog, it lists the sources. But we get the Reuteri from the company BioGaia, Biogaia, or the U.S. distributor, Everidis, Everidis. And I would buy the Osfortis product, Osfortis. You can buy the Gastrus product, but the Gastrus it's kind of a pain because it's made for babies, and you have to crush 10 tablets. The Osfortis comes as a higher potency capsule, 5 billion counts per capsule. And one capsule, you're in business. The Gasserai, Joe Mercola, the doc, so this came from South Korea. And then it was acquired by a U.S. company. Now, Chris Hansen, one of the world's biggest probiotic manufacturers. And when you buy it from a manufacturer, they want you to buy like 100 kilograms for many hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're not going to do that. So we wait for somebody, a retailer who's got deep pockets, who can buy those big minimum orders. And Mercola did that. He bought a bunch and sells it to you for a few dollars as the Lactobacillus gasseri BNR17. The Cutting Edge Cultures also has an alternative form. It's Superfood L. gasseri, I think he calls it. And that's the 2055 strain from Japan. That's a good strain also. So you got two choices with the gasseri.
All right, go over that again, all three of them, just so we have it all in one neat little package here.
So Lactobacillus reuteri, Google BioGaia. You can get it from Amazon. Easiest thing to do. But it's BioGaia, Biogaia, Osfortis, Osfortis. The reason it's called Osfortis, by the way, is because they conducted a clinical trial in elderly ladies, 75 to 80, 10 billion counts per day of the reuteri versus placebo, and the ladies who took the reuteri had 50% less loss of bone density. Nothing else taken. No calcium, no vitamin D, nothing. Just reuteri, and 50% less bone density loss. So it's called Osfortis for bone. And then the gasseri, you either get it from Mercola Market or Cutting Edge Cultures. Both strains work. And then the Bacillus coagulans, GBI 306086, is Walgreens, Target, Walmart, or the equivalents in your part of the world. And here it's called Shift Digestive Advantage. And just one capsule. So you have to go through the hassle of getting it. To my knowledge, Jesse, no one's like put it all together because it's three different sources, three different companies. Now, we are doing animal and human work because I'd like to come back in a year and say, Jesse, we found several strains more that work and do it even better. So comparative animal work first, then validation humans. But it takes time and money to do that because I'm not pharma. I don't have a research budget of $26 billion.
All right, so we have these three different species. You mentioned before the fact that these are bacteria that need to be at a warmer temperature to proliferate. So we're going to make the yogurt in something like a yogurt maker. And once we have the combo of these three, we can just use that as our starter culture, the yogurt, to continue to make it again and again. So when we ingest this, coming back to something you talked about before, there's two different areas that it's going to impact, the way I understand it. It's going to go down and to the lower bowel and help with the population there, help tame some of the bad guys down there. And then also it's going to populate within the small bowel, produce these antibacterial compounds, and kill the SIBO directly there.
Just so you know, I concocted this hoping a handful of people would feel a little relief. I did not expect it to have 90% or more success in doing better than conventional antibiotics. If you take Xifaxan, one, it costs about $1,200. And the U.S. not covered by insurance. I'm not sure how it would work in Canada, but it's very expensive, a lot of side effects, and you take it for 2 weeks, and its efficacy is 50 to 60%. So if I could have had 50% success with our SIBO Yogurt, I would have been thrilled. So I did not expect that nearly everybody responds. And here's another thing, too. I kind of regret calling it SIBO Yogurt because it makes people think you just take it to treat SIBO. But what we're really doing is replacing what's called keystone species, very important foundational species that you should have had from mom at birth and infancy, but it got eradicated. So what we do is take it for 4 weeks, or if you had a really bad case, some people say things like this: I had to take antibiotics for 3 years continuously for my acne, or something like that. And they have really messed up microbiomes. They might have to do the yogurt for 3 months or 4 months. And by the way, you can co-ferment them all together. Some people like to ferment each of them individually. If you do that, the Bacillus coagulans tolerates even higher temperatures of about 115 to 122 degrees. If you co-ferment them, we use 106 degrees only because even though it doesn't make Bacillus coagulans the happiest, we don't kill the Reuteri that dies at about 109 degrees. So we compromise at 106, and it seems to work just fine. So you can co-ferment them together, or some people like to do them separately and then combine them at time of consumption. But to my great surprise, this really works. But it really helps also. Let's say you ate it for 4 weeks, you feel better. Here's where it gets complicated. If you're using the air device, stop the yogurts for at least the Reuteri for 2 weeks, because the Reuteri will generate a positive reading because it produces H2 gas in the small bowel. Very confusing. But and then you can resume it once you test negative. Or if you know there's something like if you have fat malabsorption or gas bloating and diarrhea or panic attacks, if you have some index symptom, you say, "Oh, it's gone," you can be pretty confident that you took care of it. And then don't eat the yogurt every day, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, because SIBO loves to recur. And so far, doing intermittent consumption of the SIBO yogurt, especially Reuteri and Gasteri, seems to have been preventing most episodes of recurrence.
You're knee deep in this. You've been doing it for at least a couple of years now. We talked, I think it was about 2 years ago. How often are you taking the yogurt at this point?
About 5 times a week.
Okay. And have you noticed a difference since we talked the first time, taking it over that period of 2 years? Are you still noticing different changes as you extend out and continue to take it?
I think the muscle restoring effect is greater. So when I first did this some years back, people think I made this up. I'm not making it up. I gained 13 pounds of muscle in 3 weeks, and my strength went up by 50%. So, for instance, Jesse, I hate going to the gym, so it's not like I'm hanging out at the gym all the time. I hate going. I damn, I guess I should go. It's been a week. I'll go for 15 minutes and get the hell out. Like that. So I'm going to the gym doing lat pull downs, 130 pounds for 10 reps or so. And then I ate the yogurt, and within 3 weeks, I'm doing 200 pounds for 10 reps. I mean, my strength just went way up. Here's what I'm seeing, I think. People who had more musculature in your younger years, like, 18 to 20 some. I used to do a lot of that kind of stuff when I was a kid. And I gained an extraordinary amount. I see this in people who are former athletes. People who don't seem to get the same big effect. They might get something modest like 6 pounds. But I'm seeing former athletes regain a huge amount of muscle and strength. So that seems to persist over time. Libido. Not just in me, but every Wednesday night I have a meeting with about 90 to 100 people via two-way Zoom. And I said, hey, this touches some personal issues, but if you're willing to share, have you had an increase in libido or in the erotic content of your dreams? All these hands go up. I said, well, tell me what you're willing to share, right? And a bunch of people said, well, my libido went up so much that I had to back down on the yogurt every second or third day because my partner couldn't accommodate my needs. Guys get about a 50% rise in testosterone. Ladies can enjoy a restoration of vaginal moisture and the lining and sensation. I tell you, Jesse, what scares me is going off the rotary. I moved about 8 months ago and it was extremely stressful. I got a bad case of SIBO out of it, small intestinal fungal. Stress can do that. It activates fungal overgrowth. And so I put myself on a course of berberine, some other things, and just common anti-fungals. The problem with anti-fungals is they can have antibacterial effects. And a lot of the anti-fungals like berberine also kill off rotary. So I'm a chronic insomniac, Jesse. Terrible, terrible sleep. If I get rotary, sleep like a baby. 9 hours, no interruptions. Incredible sleep. When I take berberine, as I did for the SIBO, it kills off the rotary, and I'm back to laying down in bed at 11 p.m., laying there not sleeping a wink till 7 a.m. Terrible insomnia. So I'm terrified of going off the rotary. As long as on the rotary, though, sleep is magnificent.
Let's stick on that berberine piece, because the way I see it and understand it, a lot of people are taking that to help regulate blood sugar long term. So in that case, for somebody that is taking that at, say, their high carbohydrate meals to keep their blood sugar regulated, you're talking about how it's going to be killing off, fungal infections, which could be a good thing, but then the bacteria, including L. reuteri.
Yeah.
So I think it's important we talk about it. For somebody that is taking that thinking it's just to their benefit, there is also this impact on fungus and bacteria.
Yeah, I think a lot of people misinterpreted the evidence on berberine and curcumin also, and some others. In other words, if let's say you take 100 milligrams of berberine, 100 milligrams of curcumin, you poop out 99 milligrams. Yet there's no question these things have real biological effects, like curcumin. It reduces C-reactive protein levels in your bloodstream. It reduces knee or hip arthritis pain. And these things have real biological effects. Now, wait a minute. How can they work if there's virtually no absorption? So this has prompted a whole effort to, let's add things to make it to force absorption. Let's add bioperine and piperine and nanoparticle emulsions. I think what they're failing to see is that what they're really doing is shifting bowel flora composition and reducing endotoxemia. So if you have, especially if you have SIBO and you reduce endotoxemia, you'll say things like, my blood sugar's lower, my knee pain is less. Those are endotoxin effects. And as you point out, what's the consequence of taking some of the antimicrobial effects for an extended period? We don't know, but bad things could happen. So I discourage people from taking these antimicrobials unless it's in the setting of a limited period of time addressing SIBO, SIFO, endotoxemia.
All right, so early on in the conversation, we talked about what your diet looks like. We're starting to get a picture here of what you do to maintain your microbiome. You mentioned 5 days a week with this yogurt. I know you're a fan of having a diverse array of different fermented foods. Talk about, as somebody on the cutting edge here with the microbiome, and I know you're an experimenter and a scientist when it comes to this, what are some of the other things you're eating and doing to enhance your microbiome?
So on my kitchen counter, I have kombucha. I've got Bacillus coagulans fermenting in applesauce. I've got Bacillus coagulans fermenting in pasta sauce. I've got a mixed fermentation, mango, passion fruit juice. I've got Saccharomyces boulardii. Oh, I should tell you about that. So there's a very interesting fungus called Saccharomyces boulardii. It's a cousin of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, used to ferment wine and beer. But boulardii is better adapted to the human body. But it's probably among the most important things anybody can do to minimize the damage from taking an antibiotic. So if you take an antibiotic, it wipes out a huge number of species. Well, getting Saccharomyces boulardii oddly manages to preserve most of the microbiome. Not all, but most. Well, the odd thing about that is you can make a sparkling juice with it. And one of the things, by the way, when you ferment, you reduce sugar content. You can eliminate sugar content, too, if you go long enough. So what I do is take a capsule of a commercial preparation called Flora Store, Florastor. I'm not sure what it's called in Canada. It might be the same, though. Flora Store, one capsule into any volume of juice. The pulpier the juice, the better, like apple cider or a thick pulpy juice, as long as it doesn't have any preservatives. No potassium sorbate, no sodium benzoate. And then cap, agitate gently, and then loosen the cap. Because at 24 hours, you're going to see it bubbling like crazy. That's carbon dioxide. And if you have it capped too tightly, it will explode in your kitchen. So keep it light, or even burp it now and then. Or you can go to the beer making store and buy these little vent caps for $2. But keep it loose and go for 48 to 72 hours. Long enough to ferment most of the sugar out. And then we consume quarter to half cup, a couple times a day, during antibiotics more frequently, because that's very important for preservation of your microbiome. It's probably not a probiotic. It's probably a prebiotic. That is, Saccharomyces boulardii does not take up residence, but it seems to nourish bacterial species. And you know what? If you ferment, say, apple cider, you get apple soda. So it's actually delicious. So that's one of the ones I have a couple of those fermenting also. And you can ferment ketchup, sauces, hummus, salsa. You can ferment all kinds of crazy things. You know, people in the Middle East, Europe and Asia, there are pockets of people who still consume a lot of fermented food. You'd be surprised at the inventiveness of the things one thing that a lot of us are a little bit too squeamish to do is ferment meats. So if you were in, say, rural Spain or Portugal, in the town center, they would put out a big spit of raw meat, Jesse, raw meat. Cover it with a rag, and then come back in a couple of weeks and take off a piece. Fermented meat. That makes me a little nervous, but there are some people in my following who do that too.
Wow. So given what you just shared, how much of what you consume percentage-wise would you say is fermented? It sounds like you're fermenting quite a bit.
You know, I'm doing it also to learn and to get new recipes, so it's not like you have to do what I do. But I would say maybe a quarter of what I eat is fermented. And if you go back towards fermented meats, then it's even greater. But a lot of us are too squeamish. You can buy fermented meats too. One of the things I should mention is because there's an increasing access to commercially fermented foods like fermented pickles, fermented sauerkraut, kimchi. One of the things we have to accept is when you're manufacturing something in a factory, they're going to go as fast as possible, right? I'm always shocked that you can buy bourbon that's been aged 18 years. Imagine that business plan. So let's say you're going to make sauerkraut. Well, if you're making home sauerkraut, you're probably going to ferment it for a minimum of 2 weeks. Well, 2 weeks is an awful long time in a factory. So they ferment for much shorter time. So what I do is you buy a commercially fermented food, like let's say sauerkraut, leave it on your kitchen counter for a minimum of 48 hours, covered, if not longer. And you allow the microbes to proliferate at room temperature. If it's kimchi, leave it out for at least 2 more days, if not more. Let the microbes proliferate further. And I think you do better. You know, my good friend Donna Schwank, who's been fermenting foods for 22 years, is pretty much convinced if you ferment it yourself using a story culture, that it's therapeutically more powerful than most commercial preparations, probably because of the higher bacterial counts. So I think it's smart to do both. Some commercially fermented foods for convenience with extended fermentation on your counter, and try to ferment on occasion something else. And you can get delicious, delicious recipes, by the way. One of the tastiest recipes I've had is quartered tomatoes or halved cherry tomatoes, garlic cloves, some green onions, a sprig of rosemary, and some cubed eggplant. And you can use a starter culture or resident microbes. Let it go for about 3 days to 5 days. the presence of tomatoes really accelerates fermentation. Otherwise, it'd take more like 2 weeks. And I like to add a little vinegar after it's fermented and then refrigerate. And it's delicious. It's absolutely delicious.
I like that. And I love that hack. I've never heard anybody talk about it, to take the commercial, say sauerkraut or kimchi, and leave it on the counter for a couple of days. That's brilliant. And one thing I'll point out as you're sharing that, when people are buying fermented foods, people that are new to this, you want to buy from the fridge, because usually they're sauerkrauts that have been pasteurized, they're on the shelf, they're at room temperature. The bacteria in those cases have been killed, or at least greatly killed.
Good point. Yeah, good point. You do want to have some indication that it was fermented, contains live cultures, naturally fermented, or something like that. There's no FDA regulation to my knowledge that makes them specify a specific way.
How do you feel about raw fermented apple cider vinegar that you can buy at the store? Is that something you take in by itself or use in some of your ferments?
I'll use it. So it's hard to use for cooking because when you heat it, you kill it. But it has some microbes in it, has some microbial byproducts. You can use other kinds of vinegars also, but apple cider vinegar is a fermented food. So yeah, it's a good vinegar. Well, some people use vinegars for acidification of their stomach if they lost the capacity to make stomach acid. It does not have to be apple cider vinegar. It can be, but doesn't have to be. You can use other vinegars too to acidify the stomach in addition to your betaine hydrochloride and seltzers. And stomach acidification, when you lose the capacity to make stomach acid, is a really tricky problem.
Tying to what we just talked about, stomach acid and SIBO, but pivoting off that, leaky gut. This is something that has a lot of controversy over it in the conventional world and even a little bit in the alternative world. For somebody that is suffering from that, does doing a lot of what we've been talking about today help heal the gut in that case?
Yeah, so leaky gut would be the same as endotoxemia. It's increased intestinal permeability, especially in the jejunum and ileum. And I'm always shocked. You know this, Jesse. My conventional colleagues are a generation behind. So when I was talking to a very busy internal medicine doctor, I said, hey, Jack, how are you managing SIBO? There's no such thing. In other words, he's going to ignore the hundreds, if not thousands, of high-quality studies telling us, oh yeah, this is a problem. It's been known for 30 years, but it's been finally validated. Now, unfortunately, one of the things we can't do is measure it clinically, because the LPS endotoxin measure is not clinically available. It's a research tool. There are indirect ways to do it. But for one of my colleagues to say, oh, it's unproven, or there's no such thing, is to be reveal your deep ignorance. Because it's not like there's one study. There's a ton of validation. Ever since Dr. Patrice Canny in Belgium first documented, he and his group, that serum LPS is a factor in driving insulin resistance and other factors. So it is a thing. It's like saying, hey, this gravity thing, you can't see it. How do I know it's real? Yeah, jump off that building. You'll find out real fast, right?
Earlier, you touched on probiotics and prebiotic fiber that you can take in a supplement form. Hearing you talk about those, I get the feeling that you're not a fan of either. You mentioned with the prebiotic fiber, it can actually cause issues. So let's pull each of those apart separately. Prebiotic fiber, again, touched on earlier, it was not a good case for it earlier, it was causing issues. But are there certain ones that you recommend with fiber in the diet to complement that can be beneficial?
So, there was a lot of debate about nomenclature, about how you name these things. People say, oh, that's a type 2 resistant starch. That's a polysaccharide. That's a prebiotic fiber. That's a viscous fiber. So what we've been telling people is, don't worry about that stuff. Those are biochemical debates. All those things provide nutrition to microbes. So the Sonnenbergs, the same people who did that study with the fermented foods, they said, yeah, forget all those crazy designations. Let's call all of them microbiota accessible carbohydrates. Let's ignore what their biochemical structure is. But even that term does not encapsulate all the things that microbes metabolize. Now, so you need these things. The problem is, if you have SIBO or dysbiosis in the colon, you can't take in, let's say, a galacto-oligosaccharide fiber from legumes like black beans. You can't say, okay, guys, only go to the good microbes. Don't feed those bad guys. So it feeds everything. And so common reaction, you've got SIBO, let's say, 30 feet of microbes. You take some legumes or inulin fiber. And you say, oh, it's stomach ache, diarrhea, bloating, panic, anxiety, nightmares. That's because the unhealthy microbes, especially if that reaction occurs within 90 minutes of consumption, it's in the small bowel. So what you do there is back off. Take steps to correct the SIBO or dysbiosis, like the SIBO yogurt, or if you're inclined, Xifaxan. And there's some herbal antibiotics you can also take. Only 2 regimens have been validated. So take care of that first for at least a few days, if not weeks, then try to reintroduce those fibers. So the fibers are very important. We're learning this because there are people who are making the mistake, unfortunately, Jesse, of eliminating those fibers. They might call it a carnivorous diet or a ketogenic diet. And the ketogenic diet is one of the few diets we have lots of evidence for. We suffer from lack of real clinical studies in diet because it's very expensive. We're not pharma. We don't exploit people for money, so we don't have a $200 billion a year budget, and so we have to hobble together our studies. So if you eliminate those fibers from your diet, weird things happen. So it's like, imagine you tie your dog up in the backyard and you didn't feed it for a week. How's your dog going to be? Dead, right? So same thing. If you don't feed the microbes the things they need, like these fibers, many species will either die off or diminish dramatically in numbers. But there are exceptions. One exception is Akkermansia muciniphila, mucus lover. So what Akkermansia does, Akkermansia is a great microbe under normal situations where you're getting some fibers. It's about 5% of your entire microbiome is Akkermansia. And it helps you control blood sugar and mood and reduce anxiety and give you better sleep. So very good. If you eliminate fibers, other microbes diminish. Akkermansia proliferates to occupy not 5% of your microbiome, but 18%, 24%, 36%, 44% becomes the dominant microbe. And it's Akkermansia muciniphila. It eats your mucus. So it leads to ulcerative colitis, small bowel inflammation, increased endotoxemia, and long-term metabolic derangements like weight gain, fatty liver, high triglycerides, diverticular disease, and colon cancer. So you don't want to neglect those fibers. And the need for those fibers is written into your genetic code. If we look at all the wild hunter-gatherer populations of the world, you'll see them digging in the dirt for roots and tubers, grabbing wild plant matter they don't know this, but they're nourishing their microbiome. So we continue that and don't make mistakes. So kids, there is a century-long experience with ketogenic diets in children who have intractable grand mal seizures. So this is a little 4-year-old who has 10 seizures a day and just getting brain damage from it. So mom and dad put her on a ketogenic diet and it reduces seizure frequency by about 50%. But what happens to those kids? They stop growing. These are children. They develop osteopenia or osteoporosis. They develop kidney stones, calcium oxalate. These are kids. Calcium oxalate kidney stones. They get constipated and they get those adverse changes in their microbiome. And so we know with good evidence that a ketogenic diet, if it neglects intake of fibers, there are some people on the ketogenic diet who are getting those fibers, and that's okay. That's okay. But if you're saying, I'm just going to eat, pork chops and spinach or something like that, where you're not getting enough fiber, then weird stuff happens.
That's where I was going to go. Keto diet with having some of the lower carb veggies. Your thoughts on that? So you're saying that would be okay?
That works. There's not a lot of data on that, but logically it works. What I don't know is whether there's some adverse changes in such things as hydrogen sulfide producing microbes like D-sulfovibrio. D-sulfovibrio is a very bad microbe that probably causes colon cancer, and it proliferates when you have a meat-heavy diet. I don't know if that's sufficient to ablate the overproliferation of hydrogen sulfide producing species. That's an uncertainty.
Okay. This opens up a lot of different questions. We talked about the keto piece, but moving to carnivore, is there any studies showing what happens, even say a month on that diet where there's no fiber? You talked about the Akkermansia and how that's going to proliferate, but even in a short-term basis, would you say for 30 days, and then if they were to go back to including fiber, would you stand against that?
Nobody knows how long you must deprive your microbiome of fiber before it becomes irreversible. It's just not known. You can imagine how difficult that would be. I say, Jesse, okay, we're going to put you in the group of people who do it for 2 weeks. We're going to put you in the group of people who do it for 4 weeks. And then we do extensive microbiome analyses over time to see who can recover and who can't. So very expensive to do, very difficult, and huge amounts of data. So to my knowledge, no one has done that. Now, we don't want to get confused by labels. A ketogenic diet without fiber is a carnivorous diet. So even though they sound different and different products go with it, it's essentially biologically the same. So I think we could safely assume that the diets that were ketogenic used in kids, as well as in adults, that develop ketosis, as you do on a carnivorous diet, were extremely destructive over time. The crazy thing about this, Jesse, is that in the upfront period, it lulls you into thinking it's good. My waist shrunk by 6 inches. My blood pressure went down. My triglycerides went down. My blood sugar went down. I'm clear. I have energy up front. Because what they did was they starved their SIBO, the microbes in the upper GI tract that were causing mind fog, fatigue, all that kind of stuff. So it's like going on a low FODMAPs diet. Just because you have less bloating and diarrhea by eliminating FODMAP, fiber and sugar, does not mean you've addressed the problem and you've righted your microbiome. So I think what I'm trying to do, Jesse, is get everyone to think a little more clearly about what they're doing. And it's always reassuring to me to think, well, how did people used to do this? Before dietary guidelines, before big food got in the way with their exploitative practices, more like what your great-grandmother did. And that's what they did. You know, they had root vegetables, and vegetables, they would ferment things and can things. And when they ate an animal, no one threw the brain away or the tongue or the heart or the liver, the kidneys. You ate them. And that, by the way, provided abundant quantities of collagen, hyaluronic acid, and other nutrients largely absent from the modern diet. By the way, ladies love this. When you combine rotari, one of the effects of rotari besides upper GI colonization is to cause a hypothalamic or brain release of oxytocin, which is incredible for skin health and other factors. When you combine rotari/oxytocin with collagen peptides and hyaluronic acid, you get a dramatic improvement in skin health. Ladies would say, oh, my crow's feet and smile lines are now gone. My sebum, my skin is moister, and my joints feel better because the rotari and collagen increase joint collagen. The hyaluronic acid increases joint synovial fluid, joint lubrication. So that's a joint rebuilding formula also. It's also a body composition modifying formula, targeting loss of abdominal visceral fat. That's the source of most of the problems associated with overweight. And restoration of youthful muscle, which is a huge advantage long-term in your health. So that combination, because you're supposed to get collagen, you're supposed to get it from animals. And by the way, not from bone broth. Bone broth has been shown to be very rich in lead, especially if you use vinegar to make it. I urge people to use what I call carcass broth. It sounds awful. But so you buy a big baked chicken, for instance, you eat the meat, you bake, right? And take the leftovers, bones, tendons, ligaments, any organs, any meat hanging on, and make broth or soup out of the vat, not just the bones. Because if you use only bones, and you break open the bones, so by the way, for the bone marrow, if you use only the bones and use vinegar, you're getting some collagen, teensy-weensy bit of magnesium, very small amount of calcium, and a lot of lead. But that's another way to get collagen. Hyaluronic acid comes from brain and skin. Nobody wants to eat brain anymore. And I see these ladies buying boneless, skinless chicken breast, right? And paying $120, by the way, for hyaluronic acid serum, a little jar, an ounce, half an ounce, and putting it on, right? Oh, smooth it, wash it off at night, no better. So taking hyaluronic acid orally is a much more effective way for skin health, joint health, brain health, etc.
How do you feel about, as you're talking about crow's feet and putting the hyaluronic acid under the eyes, it gets me thinking about our skin microbiome. How do you feel about taking microbes and applying them to the skin and not just internally?
It seems to work, Jesse. So people will take things like kefir or one of the yogurts like Reprogram Yogurt or even commercial yogurt, which has almost nothing in it, by the way, but do it. And there seems to be positive effects, even with something like eczema. But it's likely not from the microbes in the food. It's once again, so if I put Leuconostoc mesenteroides and Pediococcus acetylacticide on my skin, they don't take up residence, but they somehow cause a positive shift in the skin microbiome, but specifically reduction in the nasty Staphylococcus aureus, and there seems to be a shift towards more beneficial microbes like its cousin, Staphylococcus epidermidis. The whole skin microbiome, as well as mouth microbiome, airway microbiome, bladder microbiome, vaginal microbiome, prostate microbiome. All these things are only starting to yield to investigation, but it's proving. So one of the most important things a woman can do. So a third of the female population on this planet has vaginal dysbiosis, disruption of the vaginal microbiome, which sounds, okay, so what? Dryness, irritation, funny smells, and discharge. Well, no, miscarriage. You lose your fetus. Premature labor and delivery. If you deliver a child at 30 weeks, that child's going to have problems for a lifetime. So it's not a small issue, but it's believed that the vaginal microbiome, when it's disrupted, inflames the cervix and causes it to relax prematurely and release the fetus or the baby. Well, one of the things that a woman can do is the vaginal microbiome is very different from the gastrointestinal microbiome. Vaginal microbiome is very discrete and definable. And so ladies who have vaginal dysbiosis have almost all lost the dominant microbe, Lactobacillus crispatus, and have allowed proliferation of unhealthy microbes such as Adipobium, Gardnerella, and E. coli. Well, a woman can take crispatus. There's only one product I know of, by the way, and it has crispatus, some other species, but it's called Jarofemdophilus. But you want it to have Lactobacillus crispatus. The amazing thing, Jesse, a woman can take this orally, and it colonizes the vagina. There's no connection between the gastrointestinal tract and vagina. It somehow colonized the vagina. Is it because of contiguity, nearness in the perineum, in the groin? And then even more remarkably, there's very good science from Loyola, Chicago, that a woman takes that crispatus, colonizes the vagina, and then colonizes the bladder, and thereby reduces a very bad problem for ladies, which is repeated urinary tract infections. It cuts them by about 50%. Not 100%, but 50%, not bad. And it reduces what's called urge incontinence. There's ladies who cough or sneeze or laugh and they pee. Very embarrassing, right? Well, this cuts back on that too. So skin, airway, all these microbiomes are yielding to investigation. One of the areas we really need to know a lot more about is the oral microbiome. Second only to the colon in density of microbes. And very interesting conversation, Jenny. There's a microbe in the mouth called Fusobacterium nucleatum. It overproliferates. It's okay to have normally, but it overproliferates when you have bleeding gums, gingivitis, or periodontitis, where it then enters the bloodstream. This is called translocation, and colonizes the colon. And the evidence is very good. It is a principal cause of colon cancer. Colon cancer starts in the mouth. Incredibly, and doesn't get there by swallowing, it gets there through the bloodstream. Translocation. Well, that means maybe the gastroenterologist should quit being so concerned about colonoscopy and start looking at your mouth microbiome and your colonic microbiome as well. And then devise ways to eliminate it. I have a very good friend, a dentist, natural dentist in Oklahoma City, Dr. Debbie Ozment, Ozment. And by the way, she's got a nice blog too, podcast. And she tests. She's a dentist, but she tests oral microbiome. And if you test positive for fecal bacterium, she'll test your poop microbiome also. She says in her experience, there's 100% correspondence. You have it. And now she uses the common antibiotic metronidazole to eradicate it, though she's working towards a more natural solution. Is there something we can do, let's microbial say, to get rid of both areas? But think about that. That's a major cause likely for colon cancer. But it starts with efforts in the mouth. This is changing everything.
Wow. And as you talk about eradicating, repopulating when it came to the vagina, we talked about populating on the skin and how, there's changes that happen there for applying topically. It gets me thinking about what we're doing to disrupt all of this. We talked about antibiotics before, but there's things that we're putting on our skin, in our mouth, things like mouthwash and certain soaps that we're using on our hands and body. So it's not just looking at it. There's two different sides to this. One being not killing off what we have through these toxic things that we're putting in and on our body. And then also to repopulate and to work with microbes to bring back the good guys to those different areas.
Yeah, I won't be, I'm not an expert, Jesse, in toiletries and those kinds of things. But I will say, as a general principle, you want to minimize use of soap, bring to an absolute minimum any use of shampoos, and of course, try to buy the products that have the least number of chemicals, like methylparabens and all those additives. Try to avoid topical application of, I think, creams and such. You won't need it, by the way. If you get Reuteri and oxytocin, you're going to find you don't need hand creams. Ladies like these things, of course. And most ladies who I talk to say they stop using facial moisturizers. So this return to the natural way, try to avoid using soap on your face. There's this thing called water you can use, right? So backing off on a lot of things that people have gotten accustomed to. Mouthwashes. My friend Debbie Osmond does say there's one mouthwash she tries to use. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name because it's not my area, but conventional mouthwashes are very harmful. It's been well documented. If you use a conventional mouthwash, your blood pressure goes up for a long time because you've eradicated oral microbes that you needed that were producing such things as as nitric oxide that reduces blood pressure. And they're not selective for bad microbes. They kill everything, including good ones. I don't yet know what we should do to restore a full microbiome in the mouth. One advantage is xylitol, the natural sweetener in apples and pears. And xylitol kills off Streptococcus mutans, which is the primary cavity causer in the mouth. It's also, I became aware of this only recently, a fairly potent antifungal. The sweetener xylitol, it itself is not antifungal, but if you take it in the presence of those fermenting microbes, like Pediococcus and Leuconostoc, those microbes specifically convert xylitol to a whole range of antifungal components. So xylitol could be a very interesting antifungal agent, because we haven't talked that much about it, but alongside SIBO, there is proliferation of fungi, and that's a big problem for a lot of people. They're having sugar cravings, they're having anxiety, they have IBS-like symptoms, and antifungal agents, detecting fungal overgrowth is tougher than SIBO. There's no air device for fungi overgrowth. You're stuck with either presuming you have it or doing a stool test. And some of the agents are tough to take, like the berberine I took when I moved. That was a rocky course. I had a few really rough weeks, not sleeping, etc. So it's not fun. And if xylitol works, I think it does. We need better evidence, but there's lots and lots of experimental evidence that suggests xylitol is a fairly effective antifungal. I hope that remains true.
And now they have xylitol gum. I don't know how you feel about that.
I think it's reasonable. I always remind ourselves, the things that really work are things that were supposed to have been in your diet all along or in your life. So aspartame was never supposed to be in your life. Sucralose was never supposed to be in your life. But xylitol was okay, because you would eat wild fruit that had some xylitol in it. A collagen, you're supposed to be eating heart and tongue and liver and intestines and stomach, getting lots of collagen. So no one wants to do that anymore. Few people want to do it. So we get collagen peptides. Hyaluronic acid, you're supposed to eat brain and skin. Most people don't want to do that anymore. So we get hyaluronic acid.
While we're talking about repopulating, specifically I'm thinking back to the vagina piece and the oral that can repopulate down there, it gets me thinking about taking that to the extreme, fecal transplants. So somebody who their microbiome's been trashed and it's in a really bad spot, taking poop from a healthy donor and implanting that in the person that's suffering, how do you feel about that?
Some kinks need to be worked out. So they screen for obvious things, hepatitis C, hepatitis B, HIV, those kinds of things. They're not screening for SIBO, which I think is a major oversight. Because if you take the poop of somebody with SIBO, you're transplanting what are called proteobacteria or enterobacteriaceae. These are fecal microbes that are not good for you. There have been, I think, a couple of deaths from fecal transplant. There's also this. If you take the feces of an obese, healthy person and transplant to a slender, unhealthy person, the slender person might have a reduction in bloating and diarrhea and get fat. So that has to be worked out also. So I think what's going to happen is there's going to be fecal banks where they screen people very thoroughly. Not obese, no cancers, no HIV, all that stuff, but also no SIBO, and has a positive microbiome with proliferation of the species you want, like Fecalibacterium and Akkermansia and Lactobacillus, and that's what you transfer. Drawback, it's a colonic transplant. What about the 24 feet of small intestine? What impact can you expect? And because it's like putting your canoe downstream, hoping it goes upstream. Well, it doesn't work that way. So if you put in colonic fecal material, how effective will it be in the duodenum and jejunum 20 feet up? So I suspect it's a partial solution. So better screening necessary, and probably a partial solution. And that's why I'm so thrilled that we're seeing these incredible effects just from this simple idea of SIBO yogurt. I'm not to say that's a solution to all humans' problems, but you're going right where the battle's being fought in the small intestine, Jesse. I'm surprised that there's not more talk about that. There's, in fact, a very hyped up probiotic where they double encapsulate it to delay release into the colon. Well, that's not a good idea because if half the population, a third to half the population, has proliferation of fecal microbes in the small intestine, you want microbes to release into the small intestine because that's where the problems are starting.
Right. I hear you. And last time we talked, I asked you straight up, are you taking a probiotic? And you weren't. You've touched on probiotics a couple times, including just now. Is there one, obviously you're somebody that's doing everything, fermented foods, the yogurt, and it's not just about a probiotic and a silver bullet, but are you taking a probiotic to complement all these other things you're doing?
You know, we're going to look back, Jesse, in a few years and say, look at what we used to do with probiotics, these haphazard collections of microbes where we didn't know what the dose required was for true biological effect. So if your microbe... So let's take a recent study using the BNR17 strain of Gasseri. Placebo given to, and they're measuring waist circumference. Placebo, no drop in waist circumference. 1 billion, no drop in waist circumference. 10 billion, 3 centimeters drop in waist circumference. Well, that's as far as the study went. Well, if 10 billion worked, what would 50 billion have done? 100 billion, 500 billion, a trillion? Don't know. But so right now we have so little dose response data. What's the right dose? We also don't have strain optimization data. If ATCC PTA6475 rhodori works, is there a strain that's better at it, at say provoking oxytocin? How about collaborative or guild effects? Microbes are like people. You don't live by yourself in isolation. You have a partner and family and co-workers and friends and communities. Microbes are the same. And that's why, so if mom gave you, say, rhodori, you'd have it for a lifetime, provided you're not exposed to antibiotics and other things. But if you take it as the yogurt or a probiotic, you have it for a few weeks. Why? Probably because you lack the whole guild or consortium or community that supports it. So we don't have that yet either. So that's why the modern microbiome probiotics are just haphazard collections with no thought to collaborative effects. And there's some other issues not factored in to crafting a modern probiotic. The closest we can come, I know of, is my friends, Martha Carlin and Raul Cano, Dr. Raul Cano. And by the way, full disclosure, they're a sponsor of my podcast. A company's called BiotiQuest, B-I-O-T-I Quest. And they have some products where they've at least theoretically combined microbes that have synergistic effects. For instance, they have a product called Sugar Shift that consumes fructose, glucose, and sucrose in your GI tract and thereby presumptively reduces blood glucose. So I gave it to 20 of my people, non-diabetics. They agreed to do finger sticks for 4 weeks fasting, and they reduced their fasting blood glucose by 9.8 milligrams, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a huge amount in a fasting non-diabetic person. It's on a par with metformin, taking a drug. So, and even more interestingly, Martha's primary motivation is the fact that her husband has Parkinson's disease, and he's had it for a number of years. And there's experimental evidence, not human evidence, that when that product consumes those sugars, it converts it to mannitol. Humans can't metabolize mannitol, but it can cross the brain, where experimental evidence, not yet human, suggests it dissolves the alpha-synuclein, the stuff that accumulates in the brains of people with Parkinson's disease. Anecdotally, she's given it to her husband, a bunch of other acquaintances with Parkinson's, and they've had what appears to be partial remission, including her husband, who no longer needs a walker to get around. He ambulates freely. So somebody needs to do the clinical trial because that's such an important effect. But that's the closest I know of, Jesse, to something that's been intelligently crafted. Synbiotic 365, SYN Biotic 365 is a pretty good product. But the one issue with that is the Reuteri strain they include is what's called the 30242 strain. I'm sorry about these numbers. Also called the UAL RE16. The reason I tell you that is a non-bacteriocin-producing strain of Reuteri. We don't want that one then, right? And so if you take Synbiotic 365, either directly or make a yogurt out of it, make a yogurt out of the 6475 strain of Reuteri, because you're not getting the bacteriocin-producing strain. So I don't know, I can't say this product, they got it right, finally. It's not happened yet. It'll happen. But I reiterate that because I hear this too often. Oh, don't tell me about I take a probiotic. No, that's not good enough. That's the least important thing you can do currently.
That's important. So point blank, you're not taking one right now.
I've played around. So I've taken Sugar Shift. I've taken one called Equilibrium, which I would not recommend, absolutely not recommend, and a handful of others. But I can't say, isn't it cool, Jesse, when you do something, you say, oh, this changed things. I went wheat and grain elimination. I lost 38 pounds. My triglycerides went from 400 to 40. My blood sugar fasting went from 118 to 82. Were life-changing. Vitamin D. No more seasonal affective disorder. I don't burn anymore when I get sun. I tan instead. Were life-changing effects. Reuteri. I sleep 9 hours. My libido's higher. My skin is different. You take a probiotic, maybe, I have seen good effects from the Sugar Shift. That's the only one I've seen. And there's some other ones that Martha and Raul have formulated. One's called Simple Slumber, and there's one called Antibiotic Antidote. I'm not clear on the science exactly, but I'm getting a lot of reports back from my audience are kind of like you and me. They'll buy Sugar Shift, ferment it to yogurt, and get a ton of those microbes. So, by the way, what you're doing with the microbe when you ferment it as yogurt, we don't care if it's called yogurt or not. We just want to increase the bacterial counts. I say that because people will say this, people who don't know what we're doing. They say, oh, Davis is not doing the right way. That's not how you make yogurt. We're not trying to make yogurt. It looks and smells like yogurt. What we're really trying to do is taking a microbe or microbes and boost their counts dramatically. So you can start with maybe 1 billion and end up with 300 billion. I've taken up to 1 trillion of Reuteri. We just want greater counts for greater benefit.
All right, when you start talking about upping it all the way to 1 trillion, it gets me thinking about, is there a certain limit that becomes too much? Or is the food, the sugar that bacteria is going to be eating off the medium, whether it be, dairy or coconut, will that be self-limiting because it'll run out of food?
As long as you're not on cancer chemotherapy or have some other immune system impairment, probably not. To my knowledge, never has there been an effect of an excess number of microbes. Probably because even if I took 1 trillion, it's going into an environment of hundreds to thousands of trillions. So it's like taking a big bucket of water and pouring it into the lake. Will the lake rise? Not really. It's not that much. It sounds like a lot. Like the BioGuy Gastrus tablets made for babies. There's 100 million. Sounds like a lot. But in microbes, it's nothing. It's nothing. And look at the BNR17 waste reduction study. No effect, 1 billion. And 1 billion's, 1,000 million. It's a lot. But in microbes, it's not. 10 billion, you start to see an effect. So what would 100 billion? What would 1,000 billion do? 1 trillion. So this is all being sorted out now. It's happening not as fast as I'd like to, because when we have, if you and I were drug companies and we had a new drug, we'd test 0.25 milligrams, 0.5, 1.0, 1.25, 1.5, 1.75, 2.6, because you have an unlimited budget. We can't do that. Every arm we add may add another $20,000. And if our budget's only $420,000 for the next 2 studies, we have to cut out some of the little things we'd like to do.
Well, one thing that's becoming so apparent as you share different stories and talk about all this is the power of the microbiome. When you talk about things like the fecal transplant and a fat person transferring to a skinny person and then them becoming fat and taking in oral bacteria and impacting the vagina and on, all these different stories, impacting the brain, the Parkinson's case. What we do know is this stuff is powerful, and it's still the early days in the big scheme of things. And it's just exciting to talk about and be part of this and to play around and experiment at this point where there's a lot more to be learned.
You got it, Jesse. You put your finger on. So I try to emphasize to people, this is a revolution. It's changing everything. I'd be really nervous if I was a pharmaceutical company representative or executive, and you're starting to see that these people playing around with the microbiome are achieving extraordinary things. A woman can prevent miscarriage or premature labor with a probiotic. There's now 5 microbes I'm aware of that can synergize to reduce uric acid, hyperuricemia. Very common risk for cardiovascular disease, dementia, of course, gout, some other things. Well, now you can reduce it with microbes. We're close to getting a collection of microbes that are very effective at reducing oxalate for calcium oxalate kidney stones. The list is growing of microbes that improve depression or anxiety. Look what we're doing with Reuteri. Reduction of skin wrinkles, vaginal moisture, boost in testosterone, acceleration of healing, restoration of a youthful immune response, restoration of youthful muscle. Yeah, you're right. It's getting really powerful. And what I love is in many instances, they're superior to pharmaceuticals. The pharmaceutical industry has had its run, and they continue to exploit the public, with most recently with the GLP agonists like Wegovy and Mounjaro and Ozempic, even though I think they never should have been approved at all because they're garbage, even though my colleagues are telling their patients it's magic. It's not magic. It destroys your health. But they didn't see the long-term outcome data. I don't know if you want to talk about that, but it's a whole story of its own. So I think we have a superior microbial formulation to GLP-1 agonists.
I know we got to part ways soon, but a couple more areas I want to touch on before we do. And when we talked about keto and carnivore, it brought up for me intermittent fasting. So we're starving, quote unquote, the gut microbiome for a period of time. But if we're doing, say, like a 16-8 fast, intermittent fasting, what does that do to the microbiome? And are you a fan of that?
Judging by metabolic effects, there's probably one of my uncertainties is a lot of the presumed benefits of time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting seem to be minimized in the context of what my group is doing. That is wheat and grain elimination, restoration of nutrients to address insulin resistance and inflammation, and then addressing the microbiome, but specifically restoration of beneficial microbes and reduction of SIBO and endotoxemia. What's the benefit of time-restricted eating and or intermittent fasting in that context? I think it's small. What if you eat at McDonald's twice a week, eat pizza, have a big bowl of pasta a couple times a week? In other words, have a fairly awful diet. Then those methods do have bigger effects because your diet's horrible. So I'm just not sure, and I don't think anybody knows where the adverse effects on the microbiome occur. How long do you have to do it? It's probably weeks, though. It's probably not hours or days. It's probably weeks because it takes that long to see a lot of healthy microbes die off and allow microbes like Akkermansia to overproliferate. So it's probably weeks. But once again, no one's done that kind of serial study to see where the timeline exactly is. Is it 2.5 weeks or don't know?
All right, last piece we'll end on this, supplements. And we talked about berberine, curcumin, vitamin D, probiotic supplements. We've touched on a number of them. But before we part ways, when it comes to the microbiome or beyond, what are some supplements people should consider?
Well, I'll make this issue, Jesse, that there's a lot of nutrients that are going to fall by the wayside because they're produced by microbes if you have a healthy microbiome. So that includes vitamins B1, B2, B3, B5, B6, B9, B12, K2, and C. In other words, a lot of stuff that people take, K1 and K2, that your microbiome, that's their job to make those things. And so I think that's what's going to happen. As we get better control, better restoration of the microbiome, that we don't need to take K2. We don't need to take riboflavin or thiamine or folate. So that's one issue that has to be worked out a little bit better, though. So the nutrients I focus on are the things that you're supposed to get, whose need is programmed into your genetic code, but you're not getting because of modern lifestyles. You're not getting magnesium because you drink filtered water, and if they grew your plants in a hydroponic garden, there's not much magnesium. Vitamin D, the reason we talked about earlier, insufficient exposure to the sun, wearing clothes, working indoors, losing the capacity to activate vitamin D in the skin after age 40. Iodine, because it's only in shellfish and seafood, but we can't eat those things anymore ad lib because of mercury and cadmium. So we get iodine. So what did I left out? Vitamin D, magnesium, iodine, omega-3 fatty acids. We can't eat fish like we want to. If we do, we get mercury poisoning. So we rely on omega-3 fatty acids. And then other things lacking are kind of optional, but because the low-fat era screwed up our diets and people stopped eating organs, so you can consider getting more collagen and hyaluronic acid. And a lot of things are changing. So I would favor restoration of the nutrients that are lacking in modern life. And I also tell people to get away from this idea of treating things. So we're not treating diabetes. We're not treating hypertension. We're not treating rosacea. Instead, we're addressing these common factors that are lacking or disrupted in modern life that, when corrected, whether it was labeled rheumatoid arthritis or fibromyalgia or type 2 diabetes or obesity, it goes away. They all go away, or at least recede. And so it's a very different concept than treating things. There's a time and place for treatment also. But for the most part, for the vast majority of modern chronic diseases that plague modern people, addressing those common factors that allow disease to emerge in the first place is a far more effective strategy, I think.
I hear you. Perfect place to end it. Dr. Davis, really enjoyed the conversation. Always enjoy our chats. Thank you for coming back on the show.
And keep on doing what you're doing. It's needed.
Now that you're done my conversation with Dr. Davis, you're going to want to stick around here and catch my chat with Tim. He's got a lot more to share about the gut microbiome. You don't want to miss this. I'll see you over there.
I think we've gone far too far the wrong way, and we need to get back to much more natural